The judge's gavel struck the polished wood with a crack that seemed to echo the sound of my old life shattering for a final time. Across the courtroom, my ex-wife, Laura, sat frozen, her perfectly made-up face a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. Beside her, my mother and my brother, Mark, shared the same stunned expression, mouths slightly agape, as if the judge had just started speaking in a language they couldn't comprehend. They had been so confident, so smug, walking in here this morning, laughing amongst themselves. They were a united front, the three of them, ready to take their final pound of flesh from the family scapegoat. Now, their arrogant little alliance was crumbling into dust before my eyes. I, on the other hand, felt nothing but a cold, quiet calm. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 1,000 times, and the reality was infinitely more satisfying. Their lawsuit was, in a word, audacious. They were suing me for $500,000. The legal paperwork was a masterpiece of entitled fiction, claiming I owed them for their continued emotional well-being and lifestyle maintenance. They argued that my failure to continue funding their lives after the divorce constituted a form of profound psychological abuse. They truly believed they could shame me into paying for their comfort forever, painting me as a bitter failure who was lashing out. They didn't realize the lawsuit they filed against me, the one meant to be my public humiliation, was the single greatest gift they could have ever given me. It was the legal key I needed to unlock the door to absolute justice, and not only reclaim what they had taken, but to expose every last one of their lies. You're probably wondering how a man ends up in a courtroom being sued by his ex-wife, his own mother, and his brother all at once. What kind of venomous pact leads to such a bizarre betrayal? The answer begins with a simple, fatal error in judgment, a pattern I've seen in so many stories like mine. It's the first and most crucial sign a woman will regret divorce. She surrounds herself with enablers and mistakes their bad advice for wisdom. For Laura, those enablers were my own family. They convinced her that the grass wasn't just greener on the other side, but that she was entitled to own that field without ever having to till the soil. My mother and brother saw me not as a son or a sibling, but as a resource to be exploited. And Laura, my wife, eagerly adopted their worldview, seeing me as a stepping stone to a life she felt she deserved, one she didn't have to build herself. They all misjudged me, and that was their first and final mistake. Our story began a decade ago, on a foundation of flawed family dynamics. I was always the responsible one, the fixer. Since I was a teenager, I was the one who worked, the one who planned, the one who sacrificed. My older brother, Mark, was the golden child, the ideas man. He had endless charisma and a string of brilliant, world-changing ventures that always seemed to be just one cash injection away from success. My mother adored him. "Mark has the vision," she'd often say to me, "and you have the strong back. The two of you complete each other." What she meant was that his role was to dream, and my role was to pay for it. I was the family workhorse, and for years, I was too desperate for their approval to recognize the harness on my back. When I met Laura, it felt like I had finally found an ally. She seemed to see me, not the utility I was to my family. She praised my discipline, my drive, my quiet determination. "I love that you're building something real," she used to say. For the first year, we were a genuine team. I was working a demanding full-time job in logistics and taking night classes to get a degree in software development. My dream was simple: to build a stable, secure life for us. I was convinced it was her dream, too, but the rot from my family spread. My mother's influence on Laura was like a slow-acting poison. They started spending more and more time together, joined by Mark. Soon the compliments about my hard work soured into critiques. This is where the second sign of impending regret always appears. She begins to mistake stability for boredom. My long hours were no longer a sacrifice for our future. They were proof I was unimaginative. My careful budgeting wasn't responsible. It meant I lacked spontaneity. While I worked, the three of them, my wife, my mother, my brother, formed a social club funded by my labor. I'd come home, exhausted from a 12-hour shift plus 3 hours of coding practice, to find them laughing on the couch, drinking wine I'd paid for. "You need to live a little," Laura would chide, as Mark would add, "all work and no play, little brother." They lectured me on enjoying life while enjoying the fruits of mine. I paid off 2 of Mark's disastrous business loans and quietly took over my mother's mortgage payments. Laura encouraged it all. "It's what a good son does," she'd murmur, before asking if we could afford a trip to Europe. Slowly, I ceased to be a husband or a son. I was an engine, and they were just passengers, complaining about the view. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was mundane, ordinary, which made the ambush even more brutal. Laura sat me down in the living room, her face a mask of practiced solemnity. "We need to talk," she began, the 4 most dreaded words in any relationship. I thought it was about money again. Perhaps Mark needed another $1,000 for a can't-miss investment. It was far worse. "I can't do this anymore," she said, gesturing vaguely around the room I had painted, with furniture I had built, in a house whose mortgage I paid. "I feel like my life is a flat line. I need passion. I need adventure. I need to find myself." This is the third sign that deep regret is on the horizon. When a person redefines happiness not as contentment or peace, but as a constant state of thrill-seeking. My love wasn't loud. It wasn't in grand, spontaneous gestures. It was in the steady hum of the refrigerator, always stocked with her favorite foods, the lights that never went out, the quiet, unshakable security of our home. She had come to see that peaceful predictability not as a blessing, but as a cage. "You're a good provider. I'll never say you aren't," she told me, a line meant to soften the blow that instead felt like a knife twisting in my gut. But I need more than a provider. I need a partner who is exciting. The irony was breathtaking. I was only ever absent because I was working to provide the very platform from which she was now launching her attack. The divorce was a masterclass in calculated betrayal. I had braced myself for a fight with Laura, but I never imagined the primary assault would come from my own family. My mother and Mark flanked her through the entire process, a loyal guard of enablers. They testified on her behalf during the asset division hearings, their faces etched with fake concern. They spoke of Laura's profound loneliness and suffering. They painted a picture of me as a cold, distant workaholic, emotionally withholding and financially controlling. They conveniently omitted the shopping sprees, the vacations, the endless stream of cash that flowed from my controlling hands directly into their pockets. The judge, faced with what appeared to be a suffering wife, supported by her loving, concerned in-laws, sided with them on almost every point. Laura was awarded the house. She got over 60% of my life's savings, the money I had painstakingly bled for over a decade. I was left with my 10-year-old car, a few $1,000s, and my clothes. The night the divorce was finalized, I made the mistake of driving past my old house. The lights were blazing, and music spilled out onto the lawn. I could see their silhouettes in the window, Laura, my mother, and Mark, raising champagne glasses in a toast. They were celebrating. They had successfully slaughtered the fatted calf, and now they were feasting. In that moment, The pain was so immense it felt physical. But beneath it, something new and cold began to harden. They thought this was the end. They had no idea it was the beginning. For a week after seeing their celebration, I let myself break. I sat in the darkness of a cheap motel room and felt the full, crushing weight of it all. Then, on the 8th day, I got up. The anger and pain hadn't vanished, but they had changed. They had cooled and hardened into fuel. That champagne toast I had witnessed wasn't an ending. It was a severance. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly, completely free. No more of Mark's can't-miss ventures to finance. No more of my mother's forgotten bills to secretly pay. No more of Laura's bottomless need for more. The parasites had been removed. What little I had left was, for the first time ever, entirely my own. With the few $1,000s the court hadn't given them, I made my move. For years, during those late nights after my logistics job, I hadn't just been studying. I had been architecting. I had designed a revolutionary logistics management software, a program to streamline supply chains for small and medium-sized businesses. Whenever I'd tried to explain it to Laura or Mark, their eyes would glaze over. "Sounds complicated," Mark would say with a dismissive smirk. "Why don't you stick to what you know?" They saw it as a boring little hobby. I knew it was my masterpiece. I rented a tiny one-room apartment above a 24-hour laundromat, bought a refurbished server, and funneled every last cent into founding a company I called Nexus Logistics. My life became a brutal, monastic loop. Code, solicit clients, eat, sleep for 4 hours, and repeat. I lived on instant noodles and the stale coffee from the gas station next door. The constant rumble of washing machines below wasn't a nuisance. It was the soundtrack to my resurrection. While I was building my empire from a single room, I'd occasionally hear whispers about them. A former colleague mentioned that Laura was struggling. She was burning through the settlement money at a ferocious rate. This highlights the fourth critical sign a woman will regret divorce. She has no long-term plan. Laura viewed the divorce settlement as a finish line, a permanent prize. She never considered it was just a cushion, and a rapidly deflating one at that. She had a detailed plan to leave me, but zero plans on how to actually live without my income stream. She, my mother, and Mark were like first-time lottery winners on a drunken spending spree, gleefully unaware that the jackpot was finite and the ticket machine was now permanently closed. They were setting fire to their life raft, absolutely certain they had already reached the shore. The first 18 months were a relentless grind. Then came the breakthrough. I landed a contract with a mid-sized regional distributor that was being crushed by supply chain inefficiencies. My software, Nexus, didn't just help them, it transformed their entire operation, cutting their overhead by nearly 30% in the first quarter. They became my greatest evangelists. Word of mouth in the logistics world spreads faster than gossip, and suddenly, my little one-man shop was a hot commodity. Within a year, I had a waiting list of clients, a team of 6 employees, and a sleek new office downtown. The patent for my core algorithm was approved, making my technology proprietary and immensely valuable. The quiet hum from my tiny apartment had become the roar of a thriving enterprise. I didn't buy a sports car or a gaudy watch. The noise of success wasn't my goal, the peace of security was. My first major purchase was a house in a quiet, wooded neighborhood on the other side of the state. It was larger and more beautiful than the one I had lost, but its best feature was its unlisted address. I started working out again, rediscovered my love for hiking, and learned to cook meals that didn't come in a plastic cup. The burning anger in my chest had finally cooled, replaced by the quiet, solid confidence of a man who had built his own world from the ashes of another. While I was building, they were crumbling. The whispers from mutual acquaintances turned into frantic, desperate phone calls. First, it was my mother, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet guilt. "We never hear from you anymore, son. Your brother has another one of his brilliant ideas. He just needs a little support to get it off the ground." I wouldn't reply. Then Mark would call, his tone laced with belligerent entitlement. "You think you're too good for us now? You owe us." I would simply hang up. Then the calls stopped, and a letter arrived. It was a foreclosure notice for my old house, addressed to Laura. A week later, I learned she'd been forced to take a job as a cashier at a big box store. This is where the fifth and final sign of inevitable regret slammed into them. She wildly underestimates her partner's non-financial value. Laura and my family thought my only contribution was the number on my paycheck. They were catastrophically wrong. My true value had been my competence. I was the one who managed the household budget, who fixed the dishwasher, who scheduled the car maintenance, who navigated the complexities of insurance and taxes. They had gotten rid of the man who quietly and efficiently ran the entire operating system of their lives. Now, drowning in late fees, facing a crumbling house, and armed only with their own collective ineptitude, they were finally realizing what they'd thrown away. They hadn't just lost the bank, they had fired their CEO, their mechanic, their IT department, and their janitor all at once. They were adrift in a storm of their own making, and their ship was sinking fast. I always knew it would come to this. When you're dealing with people whose sense of entitlement is a core personality trait, their desperation doesn't lead to self-reflection. It curdles into aggression. So when the thick, official-looking envelope arrived at my office via a process server, I wasn't shocked or angry. I felt a grim sense of finality. It was the lawsuit. As I read the summons, a short, cold laugh escaped my lips. Their reasoning was even more pathologically insane than I could have possibly imagined. They had discovered the success of my company, likely through an online business journal, and in their profoundly warped reality, they had decided they were the ones responsible for it. Their legal argument, spun by some hungry, low-rent lawyer working on contingency, was a true masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. They claimed that by divorcing me, Laura had liberated me from the distractions of domestic life, which provided the unique emotional and psychological catalyst for me to create my company. My mother and Mark, by supporting her noble quest for self-discovery, were co-authors of this liberation. Therefore, my 8-figure success was a direct fruit of their actions. It wasn't my decade of work, my intellect, or my sleepless nights that built my company. It was their grand act of betrayal. They weren't asking for a handout. They were demanding their rightful share of the profits. They genuinely believed they were my silent partners, and they were here to collect their dividends. Their lawyer must have thought he'd hit the jackpot, a sympathetic, down-on-her-luck ex-wife and her struggling family versus a cold, newly minted millionaire. The optics, he probably assumed, were perfect for shaming me into a quick, quiet, 7-figure settlement. They grievously miscalculated my resolve. They saw the lawsuit as a cudgel to beat me into submission. I saw it for what it was, a beautifully wrapped gift. The day I was served, I didn't panic. I made one phone call to Marcus Thorne, the most feared corporate litigator in the state, a shark known for surgically dismantling his opponents long before they ever saw the inside of a courtroom. I laid out the entire history to Thorne, from the family dynamic to the divorce to the foreclosure notice. He was silent for a long moment, and then I heard a low chuckle on the other end of the line. "Mr. Evans," he said, his voice like cracking leather, This isn't a lawsuit. It's a confession. They've just handed us a signed one. The most exquisite part of their legal gambit was a little process called discovery. By suing me and making claims about their financial hardship, they had legally opened their entire lives to us. We could subpoena everything, every bank statement, every credit card bill, every text message and email related to their finances. They thought they were putting my wealth on trial. In reality, they had just volunteered for a full forensic audit of their own lives, conducted by the most merciless auditor they would ever meet. The day we walked into court, they were radiating a smug, theatrical confidence. Laura was dressed in a modest, tasteful outfit designed to project victimhood. My mother clutched a handkerchief, ready to produce tears on command. Mark stood tall, a look of righteous indignation plastered on his face as if he were defending a noble cause. They huddled with their lawyer, whispering and nodding like actors before a big performance. They genuinely believed this was their show. I sat beside Marcus Thorne, silent and still, my hands resting on the thick stack of files that contained the truth. Their lawyer opened with a rambling, emotional monologue about family duty, moral obligation, and the coldness of new money. He painted me as a callous dragon-hoarding treasure, while my deserving family starved outside the cave. Then, it was Thorne's turn. He didn't rise with passion. He rose with the calm, lethal precision of a surgeon. "Your Honor," he began, his voice filling the quiet room. "The plaintiffs claim they are owed compensation for creating the conditions that led to my client's success. We don't dispute this claim. In fact, we'd like to explore it. Let's examine those conditions in detail." For the next 2 hours, Thorne walked the court through their lives since the divorce, using their own subpoenaed financial records as his script. He projected their credit card statements onto the screen, statements showing 5-star hotel stays, spa packages, and high-end retail purchases, all occurring months after they claimed to be destitute. He showed the court the wire transfers from Laura's settlement account directly to Mark for 3 separate ventures that vanished without a trace. He displayed the string of default notices on the house, proving their catastrophic mismanagement. The evidence was a mountain, and it buried them. It painted a portrait not of struggling victims, but of reckless, entitled parasites who had burned through a fortune and were now desperately seeking a new host. When I took the stand, Thorne's questions were simple and direct. He had me describe my apartment over the laundromat. He had me detail my 18-hour workdays. He submitted my bank statements from that period, showing a life lived on less than $1,000 a month. The contrast was stark, silent, and damning. Then came the moment from the beginning of our story. The judge, an older man with a reputation for sharp intellect and little patience, stared down at Laura, my mother, and Mark. His face was a mask of cold fury. "In my 30 years on the bench," he said, his voice dangerously low and clear, "I have never witnessed such a breathtaking combination of greed, arrogance, and profound delusion. You claim to be the architects of his success. The evidence clearly shows you were the anchors he finally managed to cut loose." He lifted the gavel. "This lawsuit is not just frivolous. It is an insult to this court and to the very concept of work ethic. Case dismissed with prejudice." The gavel slammed down, but Thorne wasn't finished. As their lawyer was still processing the loss, Thorne rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we have one further matter. We are filing a countersuit for the full reimbursement of our legal fees and for civil fraud, based on the plaintiff's conspiratorial testimony during the original divorce proceedings." He held up the transcript from 6 years ago. "Their coordinated effort to defraud my client of his assets is now a matter of record, corroborated by the very evidence they so helpfully provided for this case. The judge looked at the paperwork, then at their 3 horrified faces. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. Motion granted. In that instant, they didn't just lose their case. They lost everything. Walking out of the courthouse felt like taking a first breath after being held underwater for a decade. The sun was bright. Thorne clapped me firmly on the shoulder, gave a curt nod, and left me to face them one last time. They were waiting on the steps, their composure completely shattered. Their lawyer was already gone, having likely realized his contingency fee had just evaporated. My mother rushed forward first. Her carefully constructed image of a gentle matriarch dissolved into a mess of streaked mascara and raw desperation. "How could you?" she wailed, grabbing at the sleeve of my jacket. "How could you do this to your own mother, to your family?" Mark was next, his face a blotchy purple mask of impotent rage. "You think you're some big shot now?" he sputtered, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You'll regret this. We'll appeal. This isn't over." His threats were hollow, pathetic echoes of a power he never had. And then there was Laura. She just stood there, silent and broken. The makeup, the designer clothes, the facade of confident superiority, it was all gone. For the first time, I saw her not as a villain, but as what she truly was, a hollow, profoundly weak person who had made a series of catastrophic bets and had now lost everything. Her eyes met mine, and in their depths, I saw it. The dawning, terrifying, and irreversible comprehension of her regret. It was a bottomless pit, and she was at the very beginning of a long fall. I looked at the 3 of them, the architects of my deepest pain, and I felt nothing. The fire of anger was gone. The ache of betrayal had faded. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness where my love for them used to be. I spoke, and my voice was calm and even, devoid of all emotion. "You keep using that word, family," I said, my gaze moving from my mother's tear-stained face to my brother's contorted one. "A family doesn't systematically exploit one of its own for a decade. A family doesn't conspire to commit fraud against their own son. What happened in that courtroom wasn't revenge. It was an audit. A simple accounting of your choices and actions. You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you have been found wanting. You are not my family. You are simply a bad debt that has finally been settled." I gently removed my mother's hand from my sleeve. I looked at Laura one last time, held her vacant gaze for a single silent second, and then I turned and walked down the courthouse steps. I didn't slow down, and I didn't look back. I didn't need to. My true revenge was never about their destruction. It was about my own creation. Their ruin wasn't my victory. My victory was my peace. My victory was my freedom. Laura's story is a textbook case, a perfect storm of regret. She listened to the poison of enablers. She mistook stability for boredom. She had no plan beyond the exit. And she wildly underestimated the value of the partner holding her world together. She traded a life of quiet security for a fleeting thrill. And in the end, she lost both. She wanted a more exciting life. And I suppose, in a way, she got one. A life of constant, grinding struggle. A life she chose for herself.